The laborers froze the instant the shovel struck something solid. It was March of 1847, and the renovation crew working on the D-Lock estate in New Orleans had already uncovered 3 identical wooden boxes buried beneath the remains of the old slave quarters. Every box held the same unsettling contents. Dozens of tiny cloth-wrapped bundles, meticulously tied and remarkably well-preserved, each one containing a single human tooth. By the time city officials were notified, 17 additional boxes had been dug up from the same patch of ground, all arranged according to the same precise pattern. The plantation owner's family insisted they knew nothing about them, yet municipal records revealed a far more disturbing truth. Between 1791 and 1823, more than 40 enslaved individuals had disappeared from that property with no record of sale, death, or transfer. The boxes were quietly taken away, the entire discovery suppressed by influential families connected to the estate, and for decades no official explanation was ever given. What lay inside the final boxes pointed to a practice so deliberate, so carefully executed, that it challenged everything historians believed they understood about power and control in antebellum Louisiana. Before we go any further into the story of the D-Lock estate and the horrifying discovery that unsettled New Orleans society, I need to ask you something. If dark historical mysteries that blur the line between documented fact and unspoken truth fascinate you, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, and leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. We love knowing where our community of mystery seekers is gathered. Now, let's uncover what truly happened in those slave quarters and why the truth was buried for so long. The discovery at the D-Lock estate did not occur in isolation. It surfaced in a city already heavy with secrets, where old French and Spanish colonial powers had left behind layers of tradition, cruelty, and silence that the newer American administration struggled to unravel. New Orleans in 1847 was a city of contradictions, a place where 3 cultures, French, Spanish, and American, collided and fused into something entirely its own. Even in March, the air hung thick with humidity, and the sweet scent of magnolia blossoms mingled with the harsher stench of the docks, where ships from across the world unloaded their cargo, both lifeless and human. The Mississippi River, swollen by spring rains, slid past the city like a muddy serpent, carrying with it the commerce and secrets of half a continent. Though the city had been under American control for more than 40 years, purchased from Napoleon in 1803 as part of the Louisiana Purchase, its soul remained deeply Creole. French was still spoken as freely as English in markets and parlors. Spanish architectural influences dominated the older neighborhoods, with wrought iron balconies and hidden courtyards shadowed from the street. Beneath it all pulsed the rhythms and traditions of Africa and the Caribbean, carried by enslaved people torn from their homelands and forced to construct a new world for those who owned them. The D-Lock estate stood on the northern edge of what residents were beginning to call the Garden District, though in 1847 the area was still being shaped by wealthy Americans who had made their fortunes through cotton, sugar, and the slave trade itself. The main house was an expansive structure of white columns and wide galleries, built in 1789 by Jean-Baptiste Delac, a French merchant who had fled Saint-Domingue during the early unrest that would later ignite the Haitian Revolution. Surviving records describe Jean-Baptiste as a calculating and perceptive man. He recognized the warning signs in Saint-Domingue earlier than many of his fellow colonists and managed to escape with much of his wealth intact, along with 12 enslaved people who were forced to accompany him into exile. In New Orleans, he used that wealth to buy land and establish himself as a sugar planter, though his operation never rivaled the massive plantations farther south of the city. Behind the main house stood the slave quarters, a row of small wooden cabins that over the years housed anywhere from 30 to 60 enslaved people, depending on the family's fortunes and the demands of the sugar harvest. The cabins were crude and unforgiving, each roughly 12 feet square, with dirt floors and roofs that leaked during the frequent storms. In winter, cold air slipped through the gaps between the boards. In summer, the interiors became suffocating ovens, trapping heat and humidity until even breathing felt like labor. By 1847, the estate had passed into the hands of Jean-Baptiste's grandson, Christophe Delac, a man in his early 50s who inherited not only land and wealth, but a reputation. Christophe was widely regarded in New Orleans society as cultured and refined. He spoke fluent French, Spanish, and English, traveled to Paris on 2 occasions, and maintained correspondence with intellectual figures in France. He collected books, supported local artists, and hosted salons where the city's elite gathered to debate literature, philosophy, and politics. His wife, Marguerite, was the daughter of a prominent Creole family, the Beaumonts, who traced their lineage back to Louisiana's earliest French settlers. She was renowned for her lavish soirees, gatherings that often lasted until dawn and showcased the finest food, wine, and entertainment the city could provide. Their 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, attended the best schools available and were being prepared to assume their places among the city's aristocracy. To outsiders, the Dulac family embodied the very best of New Orleans society, cultivated, wealthy, and beyond reproach. Yet those who worked closest to them, the household servants who witnessed their private lives, the merchants who delivered supplies to the estate, the neighbors whose properties bordered theirs, whispered of something far darker. The Dulac estate was known for an unusually high turnover of enslaved laborers. People would arrive, purchased at the slave markets along Chartres Street or transferred from other plantations, work for months or sometimes years, and then simply vanish from the property. When questioned, the family offered vague and familiar explanations. Sold to a plantation upriver, sent to serve in the household of a relative immobile, succumbed to fever and buried in the pauper's field outside the city. Such explanations went largely unquestioned because they were common. Enslaved people were. Property was property, and property changed hands constantly. Illness was rampant in New Orleans, especially during the summer months when yellow fever swept through the city with relentless regularity. Death was so common it barely drew notice. Yet there were inconsistencies that unsettled those who paid close attention. Bills of sale that should have accompanied the transfer of enslaved people were nowhere to be found. Death certificates that should have been filed with city authorities simply did not exist. And on occasion, individuals who were said to have been sold to plantations upriver were spotted months later back in New Orleans, laboring for different masters, with no memory of ever leaving the city at all, or with recollections so fractured and confused that they could not give a clear account of what had happened to them. One of the people who noticed these troubling discrepancies was Father Antoine Blanc, a Catholic priest who ministered to New Orleans' French-speaking community. Father Blanc had spent more than 20 years hearing confessions and offering spiritual counsel to both free and enslaved people, earning a reputation as a man who genuinely cared for the souls entrusted to him, regardless of their station in life. In the spring of 1846, a full year before the boxes were uncovered, Father Blanc was approached by an elderly enslaved woman named Josephine, who worked inside the Dulac household. Josephine had been with the family for over 3 decades, having been purchased by Jean-Baptiste himself sometime in the 1810s. She was one of the rare enslaved people who would remain on the estate for such an extended period, and she had watched dozens of others arrive and disappear. Josephine told Father Blanc a story that deeply disturbed him. She claimed that Jean-Baptiste Dulac had exercised a form of control over the enslaved people on his property that went far beyond the usual brutalities of slavery. According to her, he extracted teeth from newly arrived enslaved individuals, telling them that as long as he possessed their teeth, they could never truly be free. The teeth, he claimed, held their souls, their very essence, and through them he would track down anyone who attempted to escape or curse anyone who dared to disobey him. Josephine herself had lost a tooth to this practice when she first arrived at the estate. She remembered the terror of that day, the way Jean-Baptiste calmly explained the ritual in precise French, his words translated by an older enslaved man who had been on the property for years. She remembered the pain of the extraction, performed without any form of anesthesia, and the way Jean-Baptiste carefully wrapped her tooth in cloth and placed it inside a wooden box already filled with dozens of others. For many years, Josephine had believed completely in the power of the ritual. She had seen what happened to people who tried to escape. They were always caught. They were always brought back. She believed it was because Jean-Baptiste used their teeth to find them. She had seen people who disobeyed fall victim to strange illnesses or sudden accidents, and she believed those misfortunes were the result of curses worked through their stolen teeth. But as she grew older, as she watched Jean-Baptiste die and his son take control of the estate, and as she saw the practice slowly disappear, doubts began to take root. She started to wonder whether the teeth truly held any power at all, or whether it had been an elaborate deception, a calculated exploitation of the spiritual beliefs many enslaved people carried with them from Africa and the Caribbean. Father Blanc listened to Josephine's account with mounting horror. He had heard rumors of similar practices on other plantations, whispered stories of psychological domination that went beyond physical punishment, but he had never encountered such a detailed testimony, nor had he heard of anyone documenting the practice so methodically. He asked Josephine what had happened to the boxes of teeth after Jean-Baptiste's death. She told him that Jean-Baptiste's son, Christophe's father, who had also been named Christophe, had been deeply disturbed when he discovered the boxes and had ordered them buried somewhere on the property. She did not know the exact location, but she recalled how servants talking about a burial that took place late one night in 1824, shortly after the elder Christophe had found his father's journal describing the tooth extraction ritual. Father Blanc wanted to investigate further, but Josephine begged him not to. She was terrified of what might happen if the Delac family learned she had spoken to him. Even though she now questioned the power of the teeth, decades of conditioning had left her profoundly afraid of the family's retaliation. Reluctantly, Father Blanc agreed to keep her confidence, though he recorded their conversation in his personal journal. Those notes would later prove critical to understanding the full scope of what had occurred on the Delac estate. The renovation project in March of 1847 was intended to modernize the slave quarters and increase the estate's capacity. Christophe Delac had recently purchased 15 additional enslaved people at auction and needed more housing to accommodate them. He hired a crew of Irish immigrants, men who had fled the Great Famine and were willing to work for low wages, to demolish 2 of the older cabins and replace them with new structures built on brick foundations rather than the rotting wooden posts that supported the original buildings. The crew's foreman was Patrick Brennan, a 35-year-old from County Cork, who had arrived in New Orleans just 6 months earlier with his wife and 3 children. Brennan had been a tenant farmer in Ireland and had watched neighbors starve as the potato blight destroyed harvest after harvest. He sold everything he owned to pay for passage to America, persuaded by promises of opportunity and prosperity spread by immigration agents throughout Ireland. The reality of life in New Orleans proved far harsher than he had expected. Irish immigrants were pushed into the most dangerous and degrading labor, digging canals in mosquito-infested swamps, loading and unloading cargo on the docks, and taking on construction jobs considered too risky even for enslaved people because the likelihood of death or serious injury was so high. If an enslaved person died, a master lost valuable property. If an Irish laborer died, he could simply be replaced by another desperate newcomer from the next arriving ship. Brennan, however, was a survivor. He learned quickly, worked relentlessly, and managed to establish himself as a dependable foreman. By his standards, the job at the Delac estate was a good one. The wages were fair. The labor was straightforward. And Christophe Delac was known for treating hired workers reasonably, at least by the standards of the era. Brennan had assembled a crew of 6 men, all Irish immigrants like himself, all desperate for steady work. Among them was a young laborer named Seamus Corrin, barely 20 years old, who had lost his entire family to the famine, and arrived in New Orleans alone, broke, and with nowhere else to go. There was also Michael O'Rourke, a former stonemason who had once worked on churches and manor houses back in Ireland before the famine destroyed his trade and left him without prospects. Another was Thomas Murphy, a quiet man in his 40s who rarely spoke of his past but labored with grim, relentless focus that suggested he was running from memories he did not wish to face. The crew began work on a Monday morning in early March. The weather was mild, with a light breeze drifting in from the river, and for the first few days the job progressed without incident. They dismantled the first cabin, hauling away rotted beams and collapsing walls, clearing the ground prepared for the new foundation. It was on Thursday, March 11th, that they began digging the trench for the first replacement structure. The soil was soft and easy to turn, a familiar mix of clay and sand common to the area. They had been digging for about an hour and reached a depth of roughly 3 feet when Seamus Corin's shovel struck something hard. Stone. Corin muttered at first, expecting a buried rock or the remains of an old tree root. But as he brushed away the soil, what emerged was not stone at all, but a wooden box, roughly 2 feet long and about a foot wide, with a flat lid held in place by rusted nails. Brennan came over immediately, and the other men gathered around, curiosity quickly giving way to unease. Later, Brennan would testify that his first thought had been treasure, perhaps coins or jewelry hidden long ago. New Orleans was full of stories about buried riches, tales of pirates and smugglers who concealed their loot in swamps and forests around the city. A buried box felt like the kind of luck that could change a man's life overnight. Using a crowbar, Brennan pried the lid open while the men leaned in to see what lay inside. There was no treasure. Instead, the box was filled with dozens of small cloth bundles, each tied with twine darkened by age. The bundles were arranged in neat rows, packed tightly together with deliberate care. Brennan selected one and slowly unwrapped it, his hands trembling slightly with anticipation. Inside was a single human tooth, a molar by the look of it, the root still intact. The tooth was yellow with age, and dark stains clung to the root, stains that might once have been blood. Brennan stared at it in silence, struggling to understand what he was holding. Then he opened another bundle and another. Every single one contained a tooth, carefully wrapped and preserved. The men stood frozen, staring at the contents of the box. The discovery was so sudden and so inexplicable that none of them knew what to say. After a long moment, Seamus Corin pointed to the ground a few feet away. "There's another one," he whispered. This time they dug more carefully, and soon uncovered a second box, identical to the first. It too contained cloth-wrapped teeth. By the end of that day, they had found 5 boxes, all buried at roughly the same depth, all containing the same disturbing contents. That evening, Brennan reported the discovery to Christophe Delac. He found him in his study, a room lined wall to wall with bookshelves and dominated by a massive mahogany desk. Delac had been reading when Brennan knocked, and he looked up with mild irritation at being interrupted. But as Brennan explained what they had uncovered, Delac's expression changed completely. The color drained from his face, and his hands began to shake. He asked Brennan to repeat himself, as though he could not quite believe what he was hearing. Brennan had brought one of the boxes with him and placed it on the desk. Delac opened it slowly, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he feared what he might see. When his eyes fell on the cloth-wrapped teeth, he closed them and drew a long, unsteady breath. "Stop the work immediately," Delac said at last, his voice barely under control. "Send the men home. I'll pay them for the full day. Tell them not to speak of this to anyone. I'll contact the authorities in the morning." But Delac did not contact the authorities. Instead, he spent the entire night alone in his study, poring over old ledgers and documents that had been stored in his state's archive for decades. At dawn, his wife Margot found him there, surrounded by scattered papers, his eyes red from exhaustion and his face drawn and hollow. When she asked what was wrong, he told her only that something deeply troubling had been discovered on the property, and that he needed to understand its origins before involving anyone outside the family. Margot pressed him for details, but Christophe refused to explain further. He instructed her to keep the children away from the construction site and to make sure the household servants did not gossip about anything they might have heard. The next day, Friday, March 12th, Christophe Delac ordered Patrick Brennan to resume the excavation, but with extreme caution and with detailed records kept of everything uncovered. He hired 2 additional laborers and offered extra pay in exchange for their silence. He also brought in a clerk from his business office, a young man named Henri Dubois, to document the work. Du Bois was a meticulous record keeper, and the notes he made that week would later become critical to understanding the scale of the discovery. He recorded the exact location of each box, its measurements, its condition, and the number of teeth inside. He also noted distinguishing details, unusual markings on the wood, differences in the cloth wrapping the teeth, anything that might offer clues as to when and why the boxes had been buried. Over the following week, the crew unearthed a total of 22 boxes, all buried beneath and around the former slave quarters. The arrangement of the boxes suggested they had been placed deliberately, according to a plan, rather than hidden at random. The oldest boxes, judged by the extent of decay, were closest to the original cabins built in the 1790s. The newer ones, though still many decades old, were buried farther out toward the edge of the property. Each box contained between 30 and 60 cloth-wrapped teeth. Some clearly belonged to adults, large molars worn down by years of use. Others came from children, small and fragile, some so tiny they must have belonged to infants or toddlers. A few of the bundles also contained small scraps of paper bearing markings that might once have been names or dates, though the ink had faded beyond readability, leaving only faint, ghost-like traces of what had been written. The boxes themselves showed different stages of age and decay. Some were crafted from cypress, a wood known for resisting rot in Louisiana's damp soil. Others were made of pine, which had deteriorated more quickly, with several boxes partially collapsed under pressure of the earth above them. The nails securing the lids were hand-forged, a detail that confirmed the boxes dated to the early 19th century or earlier, before machine-made nails became common. Brennan carefully documented the location of each box, creating a rough map of the excavation site. He noticed that the boxes appeared to be laid out in loose rows, as though they had been buried according to a specific system. The arrangement suggested deliberate organization, rather than the random disposal of unwanted objects. On the 8th day of excavation, Tuesday, March 16th, the crew made a discovery that would prove critical to understanding everything else. They were working near the foundation of the oldest cabin, the one dating back to the 1790s, when they uncovered a box unlike the others. This one was larger, roughly 3 feet long and 2 feet wide, and constructed from a much harder wood that had resisted decay far better than the pine boxes found earlier. The wood appeared to be mahogany, an expensive material that suggested this box had been considered more significant than the rest. The lid was secured not only with nails, but with a small brass lock. The lock had corroded over the decades and broke easily when Brennan applied pressure. Inside, along with the usual cloth-wrapped teeth, nearly 80 of them, was a leather-bound journal. The journal was in remarkably good condition, protected by the sealed box and the relatively dry soil. Its leather cover was embossed with the initials JBD. The pages were filled with neat French handwriting, with dated entries spanning from 1791 to 1823. Brennan could not read French, but he immediately understood the importance of the discovery. He brought the journal straight to Christophe Delac, who took it without a word and retreated into his study. He did not emerge for the rest of the day. That night, Margot Delac sent for the family physician, Dr. Henri Laveau, claiming that her husband had fallen ill. Dr. Laveau was a respected figure in New Orleans medical circles, a Creole physician who had studied in Paris and served many of the city's most prominent families. He had been the Delac family doctor for more than 15 years and had delivered all 3 of Christophe's children. When he arrived, he found Christophe in a state of extreme agitation, pacing his study with a journal clutched tightly in his hands. The doctor later testified that Christophe had been nearly incoherent, his words spilling over one another as he tried to explain what he had discovered. He kept repeating the same phrase over and over again. He documented everything. My God, he documented everything. Dr. Laveau eventually managed to calm him enough to learn what had shaken him so deeply. The journal, Christophe explained, had been written by his grandfather, Jean-Baptiste Delac. It was a meticulous record of a practice Jean-Baptiste had implemented on the plantation, a system of control that extended far beyond the familiar brutalities of slavery. Dr. Laveau asked to examine the journal, and Christophe handed it over with trembling hands. The physician read through several entries, his expression darkening with each page. The writing was clear and precise, composed with the detached tone of a man recording scientific observations rather than acts of cruelty. The first entry was dated November 3rd, 1791, only months after Jean-Baptiste's arrival in New Orleans from Saint-Domingue. It read, "Today I have implemented a new method of ensuring compliance among the workers. Having observed the effectiveness of psychological control in Saint-Domingue, I have adapted a practice that exploits the spiritual beliefs common among those brought from Africa and the Caribbean islands. Upon arrival, each worker will have a tooth extracted. The tooth will be preserved and stored, and the worker will be informed that their essence is now held by the Delac family. Should they attempt escape or prove disobedient, the tooth will be used to track them and ensure their return. The fear of spiritual bondage, I have observed, is often more effective than physical restraint." The entry continued with clinical details about the first extraction, performed on a man named Baptiste, who had been brought from Saint-Domingue with Jean-Baptiste himself. The extraction had been carried out by a local physician who was paid generously for his silence. No anesthetic was used. Baptiste was told that his tooth now contained his soul, and that it would remain in Jean-Baptiste's possession for as long as he lived. Subsequent entries documented hundreds of similar extractions over the following 3 decades. Jean-Baptiste kept exhaustive records of each person subjected to procedure, noting their name, approximate age, place of origin, and the date of the extraction. He also recorded their behavior afterward, carefully observing whether the psychological control had been effective. Most entries suggested the practice worked exactly as he intended. People whose teeth had been taken rarely attempted to escape, and when they did, they were often caught quickly, not because of any supernatural power, but because their fear of the supposed curse made them careless and easy to track. Believing they could never truly be free while Jean-Baptiste held their teeth, they failed to plan properly or travel far enough to avoid capture. But the journal revealed something even more disturbing than extractions from the living. Jean-Baptiste also recorded what he did when enslaved people died on property, whether from illness, accident, or the brutal conditions of their labor. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves in a distant corner of the estate, but not before additional teeth were removed. These teeth were added to boxes, ensuring that even in death, the enslaved remained under Delac control. The entries describing these post-mortem extractions were especially chilling in their emotional detachment. Marie, age 24, succumbed to fever on July 18th. 3 teeth extracted prior to burial. Subject had been compliant throughout her service. Teeth stored in box 7. Jacques, age 16, died from injuries sustained in mill accident. 2 teeth extracted. Subject had shown signs of rebelliousness. Teeth stored in box 12 as warning to others. Dr. Laveau read through dozens of these entries, his stomach tightening with each one. He had known the Delac family for years. He had attended their gatherings, delivered their children, and considered Christophe a friend. To realize that this practice had taken place on the property, that the boxes of teeth represented decades of systematic psychological torture, was almost impossible to comprehend. What disturbed Dr. Laveau most, however, was the realization that Jean-Baptiste's practice had not been unique. Scattered throughout the journal were references to other plantation owners who consulted with Jean-Baptiste about his methods. Some entries were explicit, naming prominent Louisiana families and describing their interest in adopting similar practices on their own estates. Others were more guarded, referring only to colleagues or associates who had sought Jean-Baptiste's guidance. One entry dated 1803 read, "Received visit from Monsieur Beaumont regarding management techniques. Explained the tooth extraction method and its psychological foundations. Monsieur Beaumont expressed interest in implementing a similar practice on his property in Plaquemines Parish. Provided him with contact information for Dr. Rousseau, who has proven most reliable in performing the extractions." Another entry from 1811 referenced correspondence from Monsieur Tibo, requesting details about the tooth preservation method. Jean-Baptiste emphasized the importance of proper wrapping and storage to maintain the psychological effect, and suggested that Tibo keep detailed records, as he himself had done, to track effectiveness over time. These passages suggested that the practice had spread beyond the Deloc estate, becoming part of a wider network of psychological control employed by multiple plantation owners throughout Louisiana and possibly even farther. Christophe, his voice shaking, told Dr. Laveau that the journal contained more than 300 entries documenting individual tooth extractions. 300 people who had lost their teeth, had their spirits claimed, and had their humanity reduced to a cloth-wrapped bundle buried in the ground. And the practice had not ended with Jean-Baptiste's death in 1823. The final entry in the journal suggested that he had instructed his son, Christophe's father, to continue the tradition. Dr. Laveau asked a question that could not be avoided. Had Christophe's father continued the practice? And had Christophe himself? Christophe's answer was complicated. His father, he said, had been horrified when he discovered the journal after Jean-Baptiste's death. The elder Christophe had found it hidden in a locked drawer of his father's desk, along with a letter instructing him to continue the tooth extraction practice and maintain the records. Instead of obeying, he had immediately put an end to it. He refused to extract any more teeth and attempted to destroy the evidence of what had been done. Some of the boxes were burned, their ashes scattered into the river, but he could not bring himself to destroy them all. Perhaps, Christophe suggested, part of him believed that the crimes they recorded should not be erased entirely. He was also unable to destroy the journal itself, despite knowing it documented acts that would be condemned even by the standards of a slave-holding society. Instead, in 1824, he ordered the remaining boxes and the journal buried on the property late one night, with only a handful of trusted house servants present. The location beneath the slave quarters had been chosen deliberately, a way of keeping the teeth close to the people they had been taken from, even in death. Or perhaps, Dr. Laveau thought, it had been a form of penance, an acknowledgement of the suffering that had taken place there. Christophe insisted that he himself had known nothing until the renovation crew made their discovery. His father had never spoken of Jean-Baptiste's practices, never mentioned the buried boxes or the journal. Christophe had inherited the land, the wealth, and the social standing, but not the knowledge of how that wealth had been created and sustained. Dr. Laveau wanted to believe him. Christophe was his friend, a man he had known for years, someone who had always appeared decent and honorable by the standards of their world. Yet as he looked at the journal, at the precise accounting of suffering within its pages, he could not help but wonder how much Christophe had truly known, how much he had chosen not to know, and how much he had benefited from practices he now claimed to find abhorrent. The discovery of the journal and the boxes created an immediate crisis for the Deloc family. Dr. Laveau, despite his long friendship with Christophe, felt a professional and moral obligation to report what he had learned to the authorities. The tooth extraction practice, even if it had ended decades earlier, represented a level of cruelty that demanded investigation. And the journal's references to other plantation owners suggested the practice may have been far more widespread than anyone realized. Christophe begged Dr. Laveau to wait, asking for time to understand the full scope of his grandfather's actions before the matter became public. He argued that involving the authorities too quickly would only create a scandal that would destroy his family, without helping anyone. The people who had suffered under Jean-Baptiste's control were long dead, he said. What purpose would be served by dragging their suffering into the open now? Dr. Laveau was torn. On one hand, he felt a clear obligation to report what he had discovered. On the other, he understood Christophe's fears about scandal and the consequences for the Deloc family. After long deliberation, he agreed to delay for 1 week. During that time, Christophe would continue researching his family's history and try to grasp the full extent of Jean-Baptiste's practices. If, at the end of that week, Christophe had not found a responsible way to address the situation, Dr. Laveau would go to the city authorities himself. Christophe threw himself into the research with desperate intensity. He spent every waking hour combing through the estate's archives, examining every document connected to his grandfather's years as master of the property. He uncovered bills of sale for enslaved people, correspondence with other plantation owners, and financial records detailing the estate's income and expenses across decades. What emerged was a portrait of systematic exploitation that extended far beyond the tooth extractions. The D-Lock estate had been among the most profitable properties in. Dr. Laveau read line after line describing acts of defiance, followed by cold notations of punishment, teeth placed in box 12 as a warning to others. He moved through dozens of entries, each one turning his stomach more than the last. He had known the Delacroix family for years. He had attended their gatherings, delivered their children into the world, and considered Christophe a friend. The realization that this practice had taken place on their land, that those carefully numbered boxes represented decades of calculated psychological torment, was almost impossible to accept. Yet what unsettled him most was the dawning understanding that Jean-Baptiste's methods had not been isolated. Scattered throughout the journal were references to other plantation owners who had sought Jean-Baptiste's guidance. Some entries were blunt, naming influential Louisiana families and detailing their curiosity about adopting similar techniques. Others were more guarded, referring only to colleagues or associates requesting advice. An entry dated 1803 noted a visit from Monsieur Beaumont concerning labor management. It described a full explanation of the tooth extraction ritual and its psychological principles. Beaumont expressed interest in introducing the practice on his property in Plaquemines Parish and provided contact information for Dr. Rousseau, described as reliable and discreet in performing the extractions. Another entry from 1811 documented correspondence from Monsieur Tibo requesting details on tooth preservation, emphasizing the importance of careful wrapping and storage to sustain its psychological impact, and recommending meticulous record-keeping to measure effectiveness over time. These references made it clear that the practice had spread beyond the Delacroix estate. It had become part of a quiet network of psychological domination employed by multiple plantation owners across Louisiana, and perhaps farther still. Christophe, his voice trembling, told Dr. Laveau that the journal contained more than 300 entries documenting individual extractions. 300 people whose teeth had been taken, whose spirits had been claimed, whose humanity had been reduced to a wrapped object sealed inside a buried box. And the practice had not ended with Jean-Baptiste's death in 1823. The final entry suggested that it instructed his son, Christophe's father, to continue the ritual. Dr. Laveau had asked a question that could not be avoided. Had Christophe's father obeyed? Had Christophe himself ever known? The answer was complicated. Christophe claimed his father had been horrified when he discovered the journal after Jean-Baptiste's death. The elder Christophe had found it hidden in a locked drawer of his father's desk, alongside a letter ordering him to continue the extractions and preserve the records. Instead of complying, he had immediately ended the practice. He refused to take another tooth and attempted to erase what had already been done. Some of the boxes were burned, their ashes scattered into the river, but he could not bring himself to destroy them all. Perhaps part of him believed the crimes they represented should not be erased entirely. He also could not destroy the journal, despite knowing it documented acts that would be condemned even by the standards of a slave-holding society. Instead, in 1824, late at night, with only a few trusted house servants present, he ordered the remaining boxes and the journal buried on the property. The location beneath the slave quarters was chosen deliberately. It kept the teeth close to the people they had been taken from, even in death. Or perhaps, Dr. Laveau thought, it was an act of penance, a silent acknowledgement of the suffering that had occurred there. Christophe insisted he had known nothing until a renovation uncovered the boxes. His father had never spoken of Jean-Baptiste's practices, never mentioned the journal or the burial. He had inherited the land, the wealth, and the social standing, but not the knowledge of how that wealth had been created. Dr. Laveau wanted to believe him. Christophe was his friend, a man he had known for years, someone who had always appeared decent by the standards of their world. But as he stared at the journal, at the precise catalog of suffering, he could not help wondering how much Christophe truly knew, how much he had chosen not to know, and how much he had benefited from practices he claimed to abhor. The discovery plunged the Delacroix family into immediate crisis. Despite his loyalty to Christophe, Dr. Laveau felt a moral obligation to report what he had learned. Even if the practice had ended decades earlier, its cruelty demanded investigation, and the journal's references to other estates suggested it had been far more widespread than anyone had suspected. Christophe begged him to wait, pleading for time to fully understand what his grandfather had done before involving the authorities. He argued that immediate exposure would only create a scandal that would destroy his family, without helping anyone. Those who had suffered under Jean-Baptiste were long dead, he said. What good would it do to expose their pain now? Dr. Laveau was torn. Duty pulled him one way, compassion and loyalty the other. After days of deliberation, he agreed to delay for 1 week. In that time, Christophe would research his family's history and confront the full extent of his grandfather's actions. If no appropriate resolution was found, Dr. Laveau would go to the city authorities himself. Christophe devoted himself to the task with desperate intensity. He spent every waking hour in the state's archives, examining documents from his grandfather's tenure, bills of sale, correspondence with other plantation owners, financial ledgers spanning decades. What emerged was a picture of exploitation far broader than the tooth extractions alone. During the early 1800s, the Delacroix estate had been one of the most profitable properties in the New Orleans region. Though smaller than many massive sugar plantations, Jean-Baptiste had achieved exceptional profitability through ruthless efficiency and absolute control. The extraction ritual had been central to that control. By erecting a psychological barrier to escape, Jean-Baptiste maintained a stable labor force without the constant losses suffered by others. People who believed freedom was impossible, even if they fled, were less likely to try. Those who did often acted under paralyzing fear, making mistakes that led to recapture. Christophe found letters from other plantation owners inquiring about Jean-Baptiste's methods and his unusually low escape rates. Some discussed the ritual openly, analyzing its psychological power and the spiritual beliefs that made it effective. Others spoke more cautiously, praising his innovative management techniques or the approaches he had pioneered. One letter from 1807, written by Etienne Beaumont, was especially revealing. Beaumont thanked Jean-Baptiste for sharing his insights and admitted to implementing the extraction practice himself. He described dramatic improvements: fewer escape attempts, fewer disciplinary issues, greater productivity. He wrote that the workers believed their essence was held captive, and that this belief restrained them more effectively than chains ever could. He had already recommended Jean-Baptiste's methods to several colleagues, and predicted his influence would soon spread. There were dozens of similar letters, all praising the results. The implication was staggering. The practice had quietly spread through a network of plantation owners who viewed psychological domination as more efficient than physical punishment alone. Teeth had become a currency of power, a way to claim not just bodies, but souls. Jean-Baptiste stood at the center of this network, a pioneer of psychological warfare who trained others to replicate his methods. Christophe also uncovered financial records showing his grandfather had been paid consulting fees by other plantation owners. These payments were substantial for the era. Jean-Baptiste had not only practiced cruelty, he had profited by teaching it. But the most disturbing discovery came from ledgers listing enslaved people who had vanished from the estate over the years. The official explanation claimed they were sold or transferred, but this was largely untrue. Many had died on property, their deaths never officially recorded. They were buried in unmarked graves in an area Jean-Baptiste referred to as the Far Field. Christophe decided to investigate. He brought Patrick Brennan and 2 workers with him. The Far Field lay at the edge of the estate, separated from the main grounds by a line of old oaks. It had never been cultivated, left as rough pasture. They probed the earth with metal rods, searching for softened soil. After hours, they identified 17 locations where the ground gave way more easily. They dug at one. About 4 feet down, they found human remains. The skeleton was small, likely a child or young adolescent. There was no coffin, no marker, No name. They rebared the remains and marked the spot. Christophe chose not to disturb the others. He had seen enough. Dozens had died there, buried without ceremony or record. As he continued his research, another pattern emerged. The family's wealth declined sharply after 1823, the year Jean-Baptiste died, and the ritual ended. Financial records showed clear cause and effect. During Jean-Baptiste's life, profits were high. Afterward, productivity fell. The elder Christophe struggled with escapes, resistance, and disorder. Without psychological terror, people tested the limits of their master's power. Margins shrank. Land was sold to preserve appearances. By the time the younger Christophe inherited the estate in 1839, it was a shadow of its former self. The connection was undeniable. The fortune had been built on terror, and when the terror ended, so did the prosperity. The ritual had not been an eccentric cruelty. It was foundational to the estate's success. Meanwhile, despite efforts at secrecy, rumors spread. The Irish workers spoke to their families. Patrick Brennan confided in his wife, who told a neighbor, who told someone else. Soon stories circulated through the immigrant districts near the docks. The rumors twisted and grew. Some claimed hundreds of bodies had been found. Others said the boxes held fingers, toes, even hearts. A few whispered that the teeth had been used in voodoo rituals, that Jean-Baptiste Delacroix had practiced dark arts beyond human cruelty. And once such stories took root, they were impossible to contain. Magic. These whispers eventually reached the French Quarter, spreading through open-air markets and dimly lit taverns. From there, they caught the attention of New Orleans' small but outspoken abolitionist circle, a loose coalition of free people of color, northern transplants, and a handful of local residents who opposed slavery on moral grounds. Among them was a young attorney named Thomas Whitcomb, who had relocated from Boston 3 years earlier. At 28, Whitcomb was idealistic and firmly believed that slavery was not only economically flawed, but morally indefensible. He had come south hoping to build a legal practice that would help free people of color navigate the tangled and often hostile laws governing life in a slave-holding society. When he heard the rumors surrounding the Delacroix estate, he immediately grasped their significance. If even part of the story was true, if a respected New Orleans family had systematically removed teeth from enslaved people to control them psychologically, it would stand as undeniable proof of slavery's inherent cruelty. It was the kind of revelation that could sway public opinion, showing people in the North, and even some in the South, that slavery was not merely about forced labor, but about total dehumanization. Whitcomb began investigating at once, carefully separating rumor from fact. He spoke with several of the Irish laborers who worked on the excavation, and they confirmed that boxes filled with human teeth had indeed been unearthed. He attempted to speak directly with Christophe Delacroix, but every request for a meeting was refused. Frustrated, Whitcomb went to the city authorities, demanding access to the boxes and any related evidence. He argued that the discovery represented criminal acts that warranted investigation, regardless of how long ago they had occurred. The authorities were hesitant. In 1847, New Orleans was deeply entangled with slavery. The city's economy depended on enslaved labor and the trade in human lives. Most of it elite either owned enslaved people themselves or were closely tied to families who did. Investigating the Delacroix estate risked uncovering practices that could implicate dozens of prominent names. Still, Whitcomb persisted, and unexpectedly, he found an ally. Father Antoine Blanc, the Catholic priest who had heard Josephine's confession the previous year, came forward. He had been deeply troubled by what Josephine had told him, and when he learned of the discovery beneath the estate, he realized her account had been truthful. Father Blanc approached Whitcomb and shared Josephine's story, carefully withholding her identity. His testimony lent new weight to the investigation, and under growing pressure, the city authorities finally agreed to examine the boxes and any other evidence that had been recovered. The strain on Christophe Delacroix intensified when another unexpected witness stepped forward. Her name was Celeste Tibo, a free woman of color who worked as a seamstress in the French Quarter. In her late 60s, Celeste claimed she had lived and worked on the Delacroix estate as a young woman in the 1790s. Her account, given first at Wickham and later repeated under sworn deposition, provided vital insight into Jean-Baptiste's extraction ritual. Celeste had been born enslaved on a plantation in Saint-Domingue and brought to New Orleans by Jean-Baptiste when she was around 12 years old, shortly after he fled the island in 1791. She remembered the extraction vividly, despite the half-century that had passed. The memory, she said, had never faded, because the pain and terror that day had marked her in ways that went far beyond the physical. Jean-Baptiste had assembled all the newly arrived enslaved people in the estate's courtyard. There were about 15 of them, ranging from young children to adults. It was a sweltering late summer day, Celeste recalled, the air heavy with humidity. Mosquitoes swarmed around them as they stood waiting, uncertain and afraid. Through a translator fluent in both French and Creole, Jean-Baptiste explained what was about to happen. Each person would have a tooth removed. The tooth would be kept by the Delacroix family as a guarantee of obedience. If anyone tried to escape, Jean-Baptiste warned, the tooth would be used to curse them, ensuring their capture and return. If anyone died, their tooth would bind their spirit to the estate, preventing it from finding peace or joining their ancestors. Celeste described the terror this announcement inspired. Many of them, including herself, had grown up with spiritual traditions that emphasized bodily wholeness and the link between physical remains and the soul. In the Vodou practices of Saint-Domingue, which many continue to follow in secret in Louisiana, physical objects, hair, nail clippings, blood, could be used to influence or control a person's spirit. The idea that a piece of themselves would be taken and held captive was unbearable. It meant that even escape would not bring true freedom. Even if they reached the north or crossed into Mexico, part of them would remain in the Delacroix family's possession, vulnerable to their control and their curses. The extractions were carried out by a physician Jean-Baptiste had hired specifically for the task. Celeste remembered him as thin and sharp-eyed, his expression cold and detached. He worked quickly, showing no concern for the pain he inflicted. Using an instrument like heavy pliers, he gripped each tooth, twisting and pulling until it tore free. There was no anesthetic, no preparation, only sudden, blinding pain. Celeste was among the last to be taken that day. She watched the others before her, saw their faces contort in agony, heard their cries and muffled sobs. By the time her turn came, she was shaking uncontrollably. Two overseers held her down while the physician worked. The pain was worse than anything she had ever known. She felt the tooth crack as it twisted under the pressure. Felt the root tearing free from her jaw, followed by the sudden rush of blood that flooded her mouth. A rough cloth had been pressed into her hands, and she was told to bite down to slow the bleeding. The pain lingered for days. Her jaw swelled so badly she struggled to eat for more than a week. Yet the physical agony, Celeste said, was nothing compared to what followed. For years afterward, she believed completely in the power of the extracted tooth. She was convinced that Jean-Baptiste could use it to find her, curse her, control her from any distance. That belief shaped every decision she made, every fleeting thought of resistance or escape. She had seen what happened to those who tried to flee the Delacroix estate. They were always captured, always returned. She believed it was because Jean-Baptiste used their teeth to track them. She witnessed people who disobeyed suffer sudden illnesses or fatal accidents, and she believed those, too, were the result of curses enacted through the stolen teeth. Fear became a constant presence, an invisible chain stronger than iron. But Celeste revealed something absent from Jean-Baptiste's journal: resistance. Not everyone accepted the ritual's power. Some enslaved people, particularly those born in the Americas with less attachment to African spiritual traditions, recognized it as a calculated deception, a method of exploiting belief for control. There were attempts to fight back, attempts to steal the boxes, reclaim the teeth, and shatter the psychological hold they represented. Celeste recalled at least 3 such attempts during her years on the estate between 1791 and 1803. All failed. Jean-Baptiste kept the boxes locked in a secured room inside the main house. Anyone caught attempting to access them faced severe punishment. One man, whom Celeste remembered as Pierre, managed to break into the room in 1797. He was discovered before he could take anything. Jean-Baptiste made an example of him. Pierre was whipped publicly before every enslaved person on the property, then sold to a trader known for supplying the most brutal sugar plantations in the Caribbean, places where survival was measured in years, not decades. The message was unmistakable. Trying to reclaim your tooth, trying to break the spiritual bondage Jean-Baptiste claimed, would lead to consequences far worse than submission. Celeste herself was freed in 1803, at around 24 years old. Her manumission was presented as a reward for years of loyal service. She suspected it was also a performance of benevolence. Jean-Baptiste granted her freedom papers and a modest sum of money, enough for her to establish herself as a seamstress in New Orleans. She left the estate and built a life in the city. She married, raised children, and developed a successful business. For decades, she never spoke publicly of what she endured, but she never forgot the tooth extraction, nor the years of psychological captivity that followed. In 1847, when she heard rumors of discovery beneath the Delacroix estate, the memories returned with force. Celeste realized that her testimony could finally expose the truth of what Jean-Baptiste had done. She contacted Thomas Wickham and offered to tell her story. Wickham immediately understood its importance. Celeste was a living witness. She could describe not only the physical act, but its devastating psychological consequences. Her account transformed the boxes of teeth from grim artifacts into proof of lived human suffering. Yet her testimony raised troubling questions. If the boxes had been kept in the main house, how had they ended up buried beneath the slave quarters? When were they moved and why? Confronted by Celeste's account and pressed by Wickham and city officials, Christophe Delacroix finally revealed what he had learned from his family's papers. His father had discovered the boxes and the journal after Jean-Baptiste's death in 1823. Horrified, the elder Christophe ordered the remaining boxes buried in 1824. The burial occurred late at night, witnessed only by a handful of trusted household servants. The decision to bury them beneath the slave quarters was deliberate, though Christophe admitted he did not fully understand his father's reasoning. Perhaps it was symbolic, a way of returning the teeth to the people they had been taken from, or perhaps it was practical concealment. Who would think to dig beneath slave quarters, structures considered temporary and disposable? The elder Christophe had also attempted partial destruction. Several boxes were burned, their ashes scattered into the Mississippi River, but he could not bring himself to destroy them all, nor could he destroy the journal. Instead, he buried what remained, perhaps hoping time and decay would erase the evidence of his father's crimes. Wickham seized upon this revelation. The burial, he argued, was proof of guilt. It demonstrated knowledge that the practice was wrong, possibly even criminal. Burying the boxes instead of destroying them completely suggested an attempt to hide the truth while preserving a twisted connection to it. Wickham demanded a full investigation. He called for medical experts to examine the teeth, to determine how many individuals they represented and how the extractions were performed. He sought subpoenas for the estate's records. He demanded that every document concerning enslaved people who had lived and died there be brought to light. Most urgently, he called for the unmarked graves mentioned in the journal to be located and properly identified. The Delacroix family resisted fiercely through their attorneys. They argued the matter was private, that the practices occurred decades earlier under different legal and social norms. Unearthing the past, they claimed, would serve no purpose. The victims were long dead. Nothing could be done for them now. An investigation would only create scandal and suffering without delivering justice. The legal struggle stretched through the spring and into the summer of 1847. Throughout it all, the boxes remained in the custody of the city, sealed and guarded. Silent witnesses to a system of control so calculated, so methodical, that even seasoned historians would struggle to comprehend what it revealed about power, fear, and the machinery of slavery. custody of the city, stored inside a warehouse near the docks. Dr. Ari Lavo, whom the city authorities asked to examine the contents, confirmed that the boxes contained human teeth, hundreds of them, representing at least 200 individuals by his count. But Dr. Lavo's examination revealed something else, something crucial to understanding the full extent of Jean-Baptiste's practice. Some of the teeth bore clear signs of having been extracted after death. The bone around the root socket showed characteristics consistent with post-mortem removal, when blood was no longer circulating and surrounding tissue had already begun to change. Many other teeth, however, told a different story. They showed unmistakable evidence of having been taken from living people, and the extractions had been performed crudely, without concern for pain or long-term damage. Dr. Lavo's report described fracture roots, splinter fragments of jawbone still clinging to some teeth, and signs of infection that had developed after procedures. These extractions had not been carried out by a skilled dentist using careful techniques. They had been done by someone with minimal training, relying on brute force rather than precision. The goal had not been to remove the teeth safely or cleanly, but simply to tear them out as quickly as possible, regardless of the suffering inflicted. This detail horrified even those who had initially been inclined to dismiss the tooth collection as a strange but relatively harmless eccentricity. The evidence made it clear that the pain had been deliberate. The suffering itself was part of the ritual. It reinforced the message that the enslaved people's bodies did not belong to them, that they could be violated at will, and that their pain was meaningless in the face of their master's authority. As the investigation continued through the summer of 1847, more people began to come forward with stories about the Delacroix estate and similar practices on other plantations. Each testimony added another layer to an emerging picture of systematic psychological control operating alongside physical brutality. An elderly man named Augustus Porter, who had been enslaved on a plantation in Plaquemines Parish south of New Orleans, testified that his former master had extracted one of his teeth when he was a teenager, telling him it was meant to keep him honest. The master had kept the tooth in a small box on his desk, positioned so Porter could see it every time he entered the house. That constant visual reminder would have been taken from him, Porter said, had been nearly as effective as chains in enforcing obedience. Porter eventually escaped during the chaos of the War of 1812, when British forces invaded Louisiana and the usual systems of control temporarily collapsed. He made his way north and eventually reached Ohio, where he lived as a free man for more than 30 years. Still, he never forgot the tooth extraction or the psychological hold it had exerted over him. When he heard about the discovery at the Delacroix estate, Porter traveled back to Louisiana specifically to testify. He wanted people to understand, he said, that the practice was not merely about physical pain or superstition. It was about power, about masters devising increasingly insidious ways to dominate people who were already completely under their control. A woman named Hannah Broussard, who had purchased her freedom in the 1830s and now worked as a laundress in New Orleans, described a similar practice on plantation where she had been held in St. Charles Parish. Her former master kept a glass jar filled with teeth on his desk, visible to anyone who entered his office. It was a wordless warning, a symbol of authority that required no explanation. Hannah herself never had a tooth extracted. She had been born on plantation, and the master apparently believed that the children of those already subjected to the ritual did not need to undergo it themselves. Even so, she grew up seeing that jar, understanding exactly what it represented. The psychological impact, she said, was profound and lasting. Another witness, Benjamin Lauren, a free man of color who worked as a carpenter in New Orleans, provided information about Dr. H.N. Rousseau, the physician mentioned in Jean-Baptiste's journal as having performed many of the extractions. Lauren explained that his father had worked as Rousseau's assistant in the 1810s and had told him stories about the doctor's work. According to those accounts, Rousseau had developed a method for extracting teeth quickly using minimal tools. He trained several other physicians in the technique and earned a substantial income performing extractions for plantation owners throughout Louisiana. Rousseau, Lauren said, viewed the work as a valuable professional service, a way to help plantation owners maintain order and maximize productivity. He never expressed remorse for the pain he caused or for the psychological torture his work enabled. Rousseau died in 1825, leaving behind no family and few personal records. But Lauren's testimony suggested that the tooth extraction practice had been far more organized and widespread than anyone had initially believed. It was not merely Jean-Baptiste Delacroix's personal aberration. It was part of a broader system, supported by trained practitioners and a network of enslavers who adopted the method. Taken together, the testimonies painted a disturbing picture. The tooth extraction ritual was not unique to a single estate. It was part of a wider culture of psychological domination, employed alongside whips, chains, and forced labor. Thomas Wickham compiled these accounts into a comprehensive report, which he submitted to the City Council in July of 1847, demanding decisive action. He argued that the discovery at the Delacroix estate offered a rare opportunity to confront the full machinery of slavery, not only its physical violence, but a calculated psychological warfare used to break and control human beings. Wickham's report was exhaustive and damning. It included Celeste Tibo's first-hand account of the extraction ritual, Augustus Porter's testimony about similar practices elsewhere, Hannah Broussard's description of the jarred teeth used as a silent weapon, and Benjamin Lauren's information about Dr. Rousseau's role in spreading the practice. The report also contained carefully selected excerpts from Jean-Baptiste's journal, chosen to demonstrate the systematic nature of the ritual and the cold logic behind it. Wickham had gained access to the journal through a court order, despite fierce objections from the Delacroix family's lawyers, who fought desperately to keep its contents from becoming public. In retrospect, Marchand realized that the sums were far too large for standard medical treatment. They were clearly payments for performing or supervising the tooth extractions, a service that Jean-Baptiste and Dr. Rousseau provided as part of a network of psychological control across multiple plantations. These records revealed a disturbing pattern. The tooth extraction practice was not only systematic, but also monetized. Plantation owners were paying handsomely to implement the ritual, formalizing it as part of their management strategy. Marchand, recognizing the gravity of the information, approached Wickham discreetly. He handed over copies of the letters and payment records, urging the young lawyer to act carefully. This goes far beyond a single estate, Marchand warned. These documents implicate families who are still powerful in this city. You must tread carefully, or you'll find yourself fighting not just for justice, but for your own survival. With Marchand's materials, Wickham finally had evidence that connected multiple plantations, showing a coordinated adoption of Jean-Baptiste methods and the financial transactions that enabled them. The payments confirmed that the tooth extractions were professionalized service, not an isolated eccentricity, and that the practice had spread widely, embedded in a network of enslavers who saw psychological control as a tool of governance. Armed with this new evidence, Wickham prepared a detailed report for the city authorities, linking the testimonies of Celeste Tibo, Augustus Porter, Hannah Broussard, and Benjamin Lauren with the documentary proof Marchand had supplied. The report outlined a system of terror that had persisted for decades, implicating multiple families and showing that Jean-Baptiste Delacroix had been a central figure in creating and exporting this method of control. The combination of living testimony, historical records, and financial documents made the case compelling. Wickham argued that even if many of the individuals directly harmed were long dead, the city had a moral and civic obligation to acknowledge and investigate the systemic cruelty and prevent such practices from ever being repeated. The revelation sent shockwaves through New Orleans. The planter class, which had attempted to suppress the story through intimidation, social pressure, and even the destruction of evidence, now faced incontrovertible documentation that could no longer be dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. For the first time, the scale of the psychological and physical exploitation, the cruelty behind the Delacroix estate's wealth, and the broader adoption of Jean-Baptiste methods was undeniable. Wickham's investigation, bolstered by Marchand's evidence, had exposed a chilling truth. The tooth extraction ritual was not a local anomaly, but part of a calculated, systemic effort by multiple enslavers to dehumanize, terrify, and control those they enslaved. It revealed a form of psychological warfare that had been hidden in plain sight, legitimized through professional networks and financial transactions, and now finally faced public scrutiny, their wealth and power into instruments of cruelty. The story spread quickly through abolitionist circles, sparking outrage in the North, but it had a more complicated effect in the South. Many white Southerners dismissed the reports as exaggeration or propaganda, arguing that the North was using a decades-old incident to attack the character of the region. Some admitted the practice had occurred, but claimed it was a singular anomaly, unrelated to the wider institution of slavery. Wickham continued to receive letters from enslaved people and free people of color, offering additional testimonies, confirming the psychological torment inflicted by tooth extractions and similar rituals on other plantations. These accounts strengthened the historical record, but they could not compel legal action. The Delacroix family and other families named in Marzahn and Fontaine's documents faced no public censure. Christophe Delacroix, despite the personal horror of his family history, remained a figure largely untouched by the investigation. His grandfather's atrocities had been exposed, but the legal and societal consequences were minimal. Yet the story did leave a mark. In the North, Wickham's report became a key piece of evidence in anti-slavery campaigns, used in speeches and pamphlets to illustrate the full scope of psychological and physical oppression in the South. Abolitionists cited the Delacroix estate as a symbol of slavery's dehumanizing power, a reminder that cruelty was not only routine but systematized. In Louisiana, fear and silence persisted. Former witnesses, like Celeste Tibo and Augustus Porter, lived the remainder of their lives knowing that justice had not been served, their suffering recorded only in personal testimonies and a careful preservation of a historical account. Over the decades, the tale of Jean-Baptiste Delacroix's tooth extraction ritual became part of local folklore, whispered in families and among descendants of the enslaved. Scholars and historians in later generations would piece together the evidence from newspapers, abolitionist reports, and scattered diaries to reconstruct the events. But for those who endured it, the trauma had long-lasting consequences. The psychological scars, the lessons in fear, and the realization that power could corrupt so completely remained embedded in the collective memory of those affected. Though the physical evidence, the boxes of teeth, was lost to fire, the documentation, testimony, and national reporting ensured that the horror was not entirely forgotten. Jean-Baptiste Delacroix's legacy, entwined with both wealth and brutality, became a cautionary tale of how institutionalized cruelty can be systematized, normalized, and even monetized. The network of enslavement, the psychological manipulations, and the chilling obsession with control revealed a form of power far beyond simple physical dominance, a legacy that would haunt Louisiana history for generations to come. Of the Delacroix family, or perhaps lost forever, without the journal and without the boxes, the concrete evidence of Jean-Baptiste's tooth extraction practice vanished, leaving only testimony, newspaper reports, and scattered records to tell the story. Despite the lack of physical artifacts, the legacy of the practice persisted. Oral histories passed down among the descendants of those enslaved on the Delacroix estate preserved the memory of the ritual and its psychological impact. Families told their children about the fear and manipulation that had been wielded against their ancestors, ensuring that the lessons of trauma and resilience survived even as official records were destroyed or suppressed. The Delacroix family, meanwhile, faded from public view. Christophe's children grew up in Mobile, distant from the social circles of New Orleans, their family name burdened with the stigma of the scandal. The wealth built through systematic cruelty had been squandered or lost, and the estate that had once symbolized power and influence became little more than a cautionary tale for future generations. William Harrison's redevelopment of the property erased the physical traces of the past, but the stories endured, whispered in neighborhoods, preserved in letters, and occasionally noted in newspapers recounting the darker chapters of Louisiana's history. For Thomas Wickham, the experience shaped the rest of his life. He carried the memory of the investigation and its frustrating conclusion, The knowledge that even overwhelming evidence of cruelty could be ignored when it threatened entrenched power. Yet he also knew the importance of documentation, of bearing witness, and of giving voice to those who had suffered. The abolitionist movement benefited from his work. Northern audiences could no longer claim ignorance about the subtler forms of oppression employed in the South. Wickham's report, though dismissed locally, became part of the broader historical record and inspired others to investigate, document, and challenge the systems of exploitation that persisted. Celeste Tibo, Augustus Porter, Hannah Brossard, and the others who had testified never saw justice in their lifetimes, but their courage ensured that the full horror of the tooth extraction practice and the psychological control it represented would not be completely forgotten. Their stories became a reminder that the history of slavery encompassed not only physical brutality, but also mental and spiritual domination, and that the human cost of systemic cruelty extended far beyond what could be measured in pounds of sugar, dollars of profit, or boxes of teeth. Even as the city of New Orleans moved on, rebuilding its economy and social order around the institution of slavery, the shadow of the Delqua state lingered, a testament to the lengths to which some had gone to control, terrify, and dehumanize others. The memory of the tooth extraction practice remained a silent warning, a dark chapter in the city's history, preserved through stories, memories, and the persistent efforts of those like Thomas Wickham who refused to let the truth be buried. Childhood experience with the tooth extraction ritual lived the rest of her life in New Orleans, running her small seamstress shop and raising her family. She never forgot the pain, fear, or the psychological weight of having a part of herself taken without consent. Though the physical evidence had been destroyed, the stories she and others shared ensured that the human cost of Jean-Baptiste's practices endured. Celeste passed away peacefully in 1858. Her legacy carried on through her children and the oral histories she had preserved. Thomas Wickham, having returned to Boston in 1849, continued his work with abolitionist causes and the Underground Railroad. The tooth extraction investigation remained one of the defining moments of his early career, a stark reminder how entrenched power and social networks could suppress the truth. Though frustrated by the lack of formal justice, he found solace in knowing that the stories of the victims had been recorded and that the nation's conscience had been stirred, even if only partially. The Delqua estate itself, now part of the Garden District, remained a silent monument to a hidden past. While the elegant homes and manicured gardens obscured the horrors that had once occurred there, fragments occasionally surfaced during construction or landscaping, as if the land itself refused to fully conceal its history. Archaeologists and historians who later investigated New Orleans plantations found tantalizing hints, partial ledgers, fragmentary correspondence, and occasional human remains that corroborated some aspects of the tooth extraction practice. Yet much remained lost, swallowed by time, development, and deliberate erasure. The broader historical significance of the tooth extraction scandalized not only in the extreme cruelty inflicted, but also in its systematic nature. It exemplified the psychological control mechanisms enslavers could employ, demonstrating that the oppression of enslaved people extended far beyond labor exploitation and physical punishment. It highlighted the lengths to which human beings could go to dominate and dehumanize others, even in a society that prided itself on civility and refinement. Though largely forgotten in public memory, the tooth extraction practice has resurfaced in modern scholarship as historians piece together evidence from archives, oral histories, and surviving documents. It stands as a haunting example of the hidden, often overlooked dimensions of slavery, and serves as a cautionary tale about the ways in which systems of power can manipulate fear, ritual, and belief to maintain control. The story of the Delqua estate, of Celeste Tibo, Thomas Wickham, Dr. Lavo, and others who bore witness, remains a testament to resilience, courage, and the enduring need to confront and acknowledge historical atrocities, even when those responsible have long departed. The legacy of the tooth extraction practice persists in subtle ways, in the careful attention to archival research, in the moral urgency felt by those documenting slavery's full history, and in the recognition that justice is not always immediate, but can be preserved through memory, testimony, and scholarship. The past, buried beneath elegant gardens and city streets, continues to speak, reminding us of the suffering endured and the human stories that must never be forgotten. The story of the Delqua estate and the tooth extraction practice leaves a chilling impression because it exposes a form of cruelty that goes far beyond the physical. It's a tale of psychological domination, spiritual violation, and systemic abuse, all meticulously documented by a man whose obsession with control revealed the darkest corners of human behavior. Yet it also tells a story of resilience. The enslaved people who endured, resisted, and lived to tell the truth, and witnesses like Celeste Tibo who ensured that their suffering was recorded, even if justice never fully followed. What makes it particularly haunting is how quickly such practices can fade from memory. Without the boxes, without journals, without testimonies, these horrors risk being forgotten, buried beneath the surface of cities, gardens, and time itself. It is a reminder that history is layered, and uncovering the full scope of human cruelty and human courage often requires digging deeper, listening to voices that have long been silenced, and acknowledging truths that are uncomfortable to face. The tooth extraction practice, while nearly lost to history, survives as a symbol of both oppression and resistance, a testament to the ingenuity of cruelty and the indomitable will of those who refuse to be broken. By remembering and sharing these stories, we honor the lives of those who suffered, shine a light on hidden injustices, and confront the full complexity of our shared past. The Delqua estate may now be a peaceful part of New Orleans' Garden District, but beneath the manicured lawns and elegant facades lie the echoes of a brutal past, a past that continues to whisper through the fragments that remain, urging us never to forget.